Hey everyone, welcome to class. Today we're going to be exploring two methods to create the illusion of depth. The ability to create the illusion of depth in our artwork literally gives us a whole new way to expand our images. Without depth, even dimensional objects in our pieces of art only exist on a 2D plane, meaning we can only move things up and down and side to side within the boundaries of our frame. But with depth, we can push our objects forward and back within our frame, and perceptually, this movement could be almost infinite. The goal for today's lesson will be to learn practical methods for creating depth within our artwork. So here's what you'll need for today's lesson. You'll need a piece of paper, a pencil, and a ruler. If you don't have a ruler, anything with a straight edge will work as well. One method of creating depth that many young artists aspire to learn is perspective. Perspective is a very technical approach to creating depth within a piece, and its applications can be very useful in the hands of experienced artists. But 1-point, 2-point, and 3-point perspective can be limiting and stifling for those who are not experienced enough to understand the rules, limitations, and proper applications for these methods. Because of this, we're going to save our lesson on the technical methods of perspective for another day. But like I said, perspective is just one method. There are many other methods with applications that are much more accessible and in some ways more effective at depicting depth than perspective. We're going to explore two of those methods. With these methods, plus our ability to critically think and problem solve, we'll be able to create expansive and deep depth in our artwork. Today's lesson will also set up a good foundation and context for us to build the later lesson of technical perspective. The two methods we'll be looking at are both combinations of concepts. The first will be scale and position, and the second will be overlap and atmospheric perspective. Now, scale, position, and overlap should sound familiar, since we explored them as methods to create more interesting compositions in episode 1 of the series. Today, we're still using these methods to build our compositions, but we're specifically going to focus on how we can use them to convey depth. Because of this, we're no longer arranging our objects with only aesthetics in mind, but in addition, we have to think critically about how the arrangement of our objects will convey depth. So let's get set up for our lesson. First, we're going to divide our paper into 4 equal sections. Similar to episode 1, these sections will serve as frames to explore the two methods I mentioned earlier. Let's fold our paper to create our frames. Our first fold will be to fold the paper lengthwise in half and crease. Then we will fold the paper again in half, but this time the other way, and crease it. Now we can unfold our paper and flatten it out. Go ahead and use your ruler or straight edge to trace over your folds so we can see our frames a little more clearly. Now that we're all set up for our exercise, let's put our pencils down and explore our two methods. Let's start with scale and position. Scale, like we learned in episode 1, has to do with changing the size of an object. And position has to do with where we place the object within the composition. Today, we're going to combine scale and position to depict depth. In order to do this, we have to realize that our understanding of depth comes from how we observe it in everyday life. Understanding that we are creating an illusion that is informed by what we see in the natural world will help us to better observe, which will help us to better replicate. The scale and position of an object within our composition will be informed by two things we observe in the world around us. The first is the size of the objects in relation to other objects we want to represent in our image. The second being the distance the object is away from us, the viewer. The object's actual size and distance will help us determine how to represent it in our composition. Before we start applying this method, we have to understand one more concept, and that is the horizon line. The horizon line is the separation between the sky and the ground. It also represents our eye level. The eye level is the height of the viewer's eye when looking at an object or scene. In observing our world, it is the line that the sun disappears behind as it sets. It is the line where roads and rivers disappear to a single dot as they move away from us. And it is the line which determines if we are looking up or down at an object. It also represents the farthest point that we can see before objects become too small for us to perceive. Generally, objects that are set on the ground in our image will move closer to the horizon line and get smaller as they move backwards away from us. And as they come forward towards us, they will move farther away from the horizon line and get larger. Depending on where we place the horizon line in our composition, in conjunction with the scale and position we choose for our objects, we can depict the eye level of the viewer. If our horizon line is close to the top of our composition and all the objects stay below the horizon line, it will give the impression that we are looking down on our objects from a very high point of view. If our horizon line is in the middle of our composition and our objects cross over the horizon line, it will give the impression that we are looking at our objects at a more human level. If our horizon line is close to the bottom of our composition and the objects are all close to or on the horizon line, it will give the impression that we are very low to the ground and looking up at our objects. As you can see, by simply changing the size and position of our objects in relation to the horizon line, we can depict depth in multiple ways. Now that we understand these ideas, let's create two original compositions in the top two frames of our paper. You can draw whatever you would like, but remember to apply the position and scale in your composition to depict depth. Since the horizon line plays a key role in determining the position of your objects, let's draw that first. Remember to critically think about where you are positioning your objects and how big they are in comparison to each other and their distance from the viewer. If you're having a hard time imagining where to position your objects or how they would change in scale as they move away or towards you, then I encourage you to spend some time observing your environment. Go outside, find the horizon line, and observe how objects appear as they move away from you, come close to you, and interact with the horizon line as you change your eye level. One thing to be aware of is that the horizon line most likely won't be clearly visible. It will probably be obscured by mountains, hills, trees, and buildings. It will take some critical thinking to estimate where it might be, but this shouldn't be too difficult to accomplish. Again, the horizon line will be where the sky meets the ground if there are no mountains or valleys. Standing on a sidewalk next to a long street is a great place to observe what we just learned. You can observe how cars driving away from you and towards you appear to change in size. You can also see how changing your eye level affects how close the car's tires appear to the horizon line. Now, once you have finished your two compositions, we can move on to overlap and atmospheric perspective. Overlap, like we learned in episode 1, is when one object crosses in front of another, obscuring our view of the objects behind it. This concept is the same for today's lesson, and on its own is a great method to depict depth. But when we combine it with atmospheric perspective, the illusion of depth can be much more effective. Atmospheric perspective is a technique we use to depict the perceived change in the value or color of an object as it moves farther and farther from the viewer. This technique emulates what we observe in nature as particles in the air like dust or moisture refract light and distort our view of objects in the distance. We can observe this easily from the top of a hill. If you notice, as objects get farther and farther, their color and value appear to change. Objects in the distance that are black will look lighter, and objects that are white will appear grayer. This is caused by millions and millions of tiny particles in the air, and the farther an object is, the more particles we have to look through to see our object. When we use this technique in our artwork, we will often desaturate colors and darken or lighten values depending on the object and its distance. For our purposes today, we'll be utilizing what we learned in episode 3 of this series, where we talked about shading even tones. We will also be segmenting our compositions into layers to simplify this effect. Each layer we make will represent a set distance, and these layers can represent different things such as water, flatland, hills, and valleys or mountains. We're going to establish a tone for the closest layers and progressively lighten the layers as they move farther and farther back towards our horizon line in our composition. If we want, we could also progressively darken the layers as they move back. Be aware that objects we place on these layers will also be affected by the tone. In reality, atmospheric perspective may not be as obvious as segmented and toned layers. Reality is much more subtle, but like I said, this is a simplified example to help us understand the concept. We can always aim to replicate the subtleties of reality, but we must strive to understand why they exist. So now that we understand the concepts behind overlapping and atmospheric perspective, let's take the next two frames on our paper, and this time we'll apply both scale and position and overlap and atmospheric perspective to create our compositions. Again, we can draw whatever we would like, so long as we are focused on applying the methods we learned. A helpful tip to exaggerate the perceived distance between layers is to use as much contrast as possible. Contrast is the difference between light and dark. If we want, we can also tone the sky. Now that we've been introduced to these two methods, I encourage you to utilize them in your artwork and experiment with different compositions and tones to create depth. There's quite a lot to explore with these methods, and as we critically think and problem solve, we can create quite complex and compelling images with them. It's important to gain a good grasp of these methods now and build a good foundation of skill and understanding so that we can build up to more advanced concepts and skills in the future. So keep practicing what you've learned and keep challenging yourself. Remember that making mistakes is part of the process of growing in your ability to problem solve and critically think. Keep your chin up, and we'll see you in the next class.